Well, hello YouTube. How are you doing today? The video that I've been trying to put together for the past few days, week or so, um, I've had some interruptions, but I finally got around to getting it done. And what I wanted to talk about was economic booms, economic busts, and false flag attacks leading to war. Now, when I looked at the amount of time that this video is getting to, I made the decision that I'm going to break it down into two videos, part one and part two. Part one is going to focus on the false flag attacks that have happened through the 20th century into the 21st century. And the second video will be about the economic booms, busts, leading into the false flags that led to war. So this video here is going to focus on the false flags. Now, what is a false flag attack? As you see what it says here, a horrific staged event blamed on a political enemy used as a pretext to start a war or enact draconian laws in the name of national security. That's what it has come to. Where it started, actually, was during the time of the Buccaneers, or what we better well know them as pirates. Now, what they would do is when they were stalking a ship on the high seas, they would spy them out. They would know what country they were from. The English buccaneers were after the French were after the English, and such, the Spanish, all of them kind of did this. But what they would do is that pirate ship would bring up the flag of their enemy and fly like the English pirate ship would fly the flag of the French. And they would do this so that the opposing ship that they were hunting down would not see them as an enemy. And when they got close enough, they would then attack. And in some cases, they would take the booty of the ship and sink the ship. And in other cases, they would kill off, or they would put to sea the sailors on that ship, and then they would take the ship as their own. Or they would have the sailors declare their devotion to the pirates, and then they would take them on as part of their crew. This is where the false flag actually came from. But this did not go unnoticed from the nations around the world. The United States is no different. Now, we've been raised and we were brought up in school and taught about the good old boys and the patriotic red, white, and blue, and how we were such great people, and we were out there as the world's police, and we were out there to take care, and we were such good people. But the fact is, the United States has enacted and used false flag attacks for a very long time, and very serious ones involving us in virtually every war that we've ever been in. Now, what I'm going to present to you is a series of false flags that have occurred since 1900. Part of this is the construction of the Federal Reserve, for which I'm going to get into. And then I'm going to show you World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam, 9/11, and where we are today. So, for right now, let's take a look at the United States false flags.
So what is a central bank? A central bank is an institution that produces the currency of an entire nation. Based on historical precedent, two specific powers are inherent in central banking practice: the control of interest rates and the control of the money supply, or inflation. The central bank does not simply supply a government's economy with money, it loans it to them at interest. Then, through the use of increasing and decreasing the supply of money, the central bank regulates the value of the currency being issued. It is critical to understand that the entire structure of this system can only produce one thing in the long run: debt. It doesn't take a lot of ingenuity to figure this scam out. For every single dollar produced by the central bank is loaned at interest. That means every single dollar produced is actually the dollar plus a certain percent of debt based on that dollar. And since the central bank has the monopoly over the production of the currency for the entire country, and they loan each dollar out with immediate debt attached to it, where does the money to pay for the debt come from? It can only come from the central bank again, which means the central bank has to perpetually increase its money supply to temporarily cover the outstanding debt created, which in turn, since that new money is loaned out at interest as well, creates even more debt. The end result of this system without fail is slavery, for it is impossible for the government and thus the public to ever come out of the self-generating debt. By the early 20th century, the U.S. had already implemented and removed a few central banking systems, which were swindled into place by ruthless banking interests. At this time, the dominant families in the banking and business world were the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Warburgs, the Rothschilds. And in the early 1900s, they sought to push once again legislation to create another central bank. However, they knew the government and public were very weary of such an institution, so they needed to create an incident to affect public opinion. So, J.P. Morgan, publicly considered a financial luminary at the time, exploited his mass influence by publishing rumors that a prominent bank in New York was insolvent or bankrupt. Morgan knew this would cause mass hysteria, which would affect other banks as well. And it did. The public, in fear of losing their deposits, immediately began mass withdrawals. Consequently, the banks were forced to call in their loans, causing the recipients to sell their property, and thus a spiral of bankruptcies, repossessions, and turmoil emerged. Putting the pieces together a few years later, Frederick Allen of Life magazine wrote, "The Morgan interests took advantage to precipitate the panic, guiding it shrewdly as it progressed." Unaware of the fraud, the Panic of 1907 led to a congressional investigation headed by Senator Nelson Aldrich, who had intimate ties to the banking cartels and later became part of the Rockefeller family through marriage. The commission, led by Aldrich, recommended a central bank should be implemented so a panic like 1907 could never happen again. This was the spark the international bankers needed to initiate their plan. In 1910, a secret meeting was held at a J.P. Morgan estate on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. It was there that the central banking bill called the Federal Reserve Act was written. This legislation was written by bankers, not lawmakers. This meeting was so secretive, so concealed from government and public knowledge that the 10 or so figures who attended disguised their names when en route to the island. After this bill was constructed, it was then handed over to their political frontman, Senator Nelson Aldrich, to push through Congress. And in 1913, with heavy political sponsorship by the bankers, Woodrow Wilson became president, having already agreed to sign the Federal Reserve Act in exchange for campaign support. And 2 days before Christmas, when most of Congress was at home with their families, the Federal Reserve Act was voted in, and Wilson in turn made it law. Later, Woodrow Wilson wrote, in regret, Congressman Louis McFadden also expressed the truth after the passage of the bill. A world banking system was being set up here, a superstate controlled by international bankers, acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure. The Fed has usurped the government.
Let's go back to World War I now. Now, what got us into World War I? If you asked an historian, they'd give a number of different provocations, the Zimmerman note, but probably the incident that was most inflammatory to the public was the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania was a British passenger ship on its way from New York to England, 1915. At that time, England was at war with Germany, but we had not yet joined World War I. Well, the ship went down, and the Americans were told that the Germans simply sank this ship to be ruthless. They saw an innocent passenger ship, wanted to kill a lot of women and children, and so down it went. But that's not why the Germans sank it. They sank it because the Lusitania was loaded from one end to the other with munitions, millions of rounds of ammunition and many other munitions. Everyone who survived that disaster said there were two explosions, a smaller one and then a huge one. The small one was a torpedo hitting. The large one was the munitions detonating. The ship went down, in just 18 minutes after a single torpedo hit. By the way, that's confirmed also by the logbook of the sub that sank. Lusitania, the U-20's logbook, said one torpedo followed by massive explosion. Equally significant, before the tragedy, Winston Churchill, who was then head of the British Admiralty, had ordered a study to be done to determine what the political impact would be if a British passenger ship was sunk with Americans on board. And there were almost 200 Americans on board the Lusitania. And prior to the sinking of the Lusitania, an exchange took place between Sir Edward Grey, the British foreign minister, and Edward Mandell House, who was President Woodrow Wilson's top advisor. Here's the exchange of communications. Grey: what will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board? House's reply: I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into the war. Joseph Kenworthy, who was then in British Naval Intelligence, Commander Kenworthy, said this: the Lusitania was deliberately sent at a considerably reduced speed into an area where a U-boat was known to be waiting and with their escorts withdrawn. Why does he say, how can he say a U-boat was known to be waiting? Well, the British in 1915 had cracked Germany's naval codes, and they knew the approximate location of every U-boat at that time in the British Isles. They also knew the location of the U-boat, the U-20, by reports of its recent activities. Now, in the United States, an official hearing, investigation was carried into looking into the sinking of Lusitania, but at that hearing, officials were only allowed to see a dummy manifest that omitted the ship's munitions. The original manifest that listed the munitions was ordered by President Woodrow Wilson to be hidden in the archives of the U.S. Treasury. Now, hearing this, some of you might think, well, Mr. Perloff, isn't that just sort of a conspiracy theory? Is that pretty wild stuff? Actually, almost everything I just said has already been on the History Channel. In the documentary In Search of the Lusitania, you can read about it in the book The Lusitania by British historian Colin Simpson, or in Room 40, which came out more recently by Patrick Beasley. Now, Beasley is a former officer in British naval intelligence, and he's considered the world's leading authority on the history of British naval intelligence. Here's what he writes in his book: I am reluctantly driven to the conclusion that there was a conspiracy, his words, to put the Lusitania at risk in the hopes that even an abortive attack on her would bring the United States into the war.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
On the 7th of December 1941, the United States was shaken to its core when the Japanese launched a surprise military strike on their naval base at Pearl Harbor. The attack destroyed almost 200 US aircraft and killed 2,400 Americans. 24 hours after the attack, Congress reversed its political position of neutrality in the conflict raging across the rest of the world.
Under the Statue of Liberty, 1,200 young Americans are marching, the latest batch of recruits to the United States Air Forces.
It declared war on the Empire of Japan, inevitably leading to war with Japan's allies, Germany and Italy.
Will give the Japanese and the Nazis a little idea of just what they accomplished in the attack at Pearl Harbor.
The events at Pearl Harbor became an important fixture in American war propaganda. But the questions surrounding how Japan managed to launch a secret attack on an American naval base persisted. In 1944, journalist John T. Flynn argued that, shockingly, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had prior knowledge of the attack, but let it happen in order to justify America entering the Second World War. In 2001, former sailor Robert Stinnett claimed to have uncovered evidence that the Roosevelt administration deliberately provoked and allowed the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor in order to bring the USA into the World War.
Unfortunately, Americans made the mistake that we have made so often. The mistake of assuming that the Axis won't drop bombs on a nation with whom they are at peace.
Stinnett argues that America had broken Japan's secret naval code as early as 1940 and was able to intercept Japanese transmissions. Therefore, American intelligence was aware of the impending attack. This was confirmed by Admiral Kimmel, the port's commander who helplessly witnessed the massacre of his crews and the destruction of his vessels.
We needed one thing, which our own resources could not make available to us. That vital need was the information available in Washington from the intercepted dispatches, which told when and where Japan would probably strike. I did not get this information.
After World War II, Korea was divided in half, with a communist regime in the north supported by China and the Soviet Union, and a republic in the south supported by the United States and Western powers. The withdrawal of U.S. troops in January of 1950 made South Korea vulnerable to attack.
Now, there are many who believe, including myself, the reason why the United States and its allies removed their troops from South Korea is because they already knew that upon the removal of their troops, North Korea had full intentions of invading, for which they did. This in turn gave the United States and its allies justifiable reason to return back and go to war against North Korea. Once and again, this is another example of how the United States uses the false flag tactic, drawing the enemy in for the purpose of intentionally going to war, because that was their purpose in the first place. And the North Korean conflict is no different. Once and again, economic boom, economic bust, false flag, war.
On June 25, 1950, 80,000 North Korean troops surged across the border at the 38th parallel and in 3 days captured Seoul, the capital of South Korea. The United Nations promptly responded with a resolution to aid Korea. U.S. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the UN forces. North Korean regulars continued to push south toward the port of Pusan, where General Walker's 8th Army fought a delaying action to defend the last major stronghold of South Korea. By August 5th, UN troops and the obstacle of the Naktong River halted their advance. The North Koreans launched violent attacks against the Pusan perimeter, but by September 12th, the offensive had exhausted itself and ground to a halt. 3 days later, MacArthur launched a daring amphibious landing at Incheon that cut off the North Korean supply lines. It was the most successful military move of his career. Seoul was retaken, and the North Koreans were forced to retreat behind the border. The UN demanded surrender. Determined to eliminate future aggression, UN forces crossed the 38th parallel on October 7th. As MacArthur advanced steadily north, the Chinese warned of possible intervention, beginning secret preparations for an offensive. Less than 2 weeks after crossing the border, UN troops captured the North Korean capital, Pyongyang. UN forces were moving swiftly. As the end of October approached, a South Korean division reached the Yalu River, the border of China. The Chinese responded quickly. By November 1st, 180,000 troops had moved south across the Yalu. MacArthur launched a counteroffensive which reached its northernmost position on November 24th. The Chinese took Chosin Reservoir and with their superior numbers pushed the UN forces into retreat. December saw the Chinese advancing steadily south, crossing the 38th parallel to take Seoul once again. General Ridgway, new commander of the 8th Army, began another offensive. Named the Meat Grinder by frontline troops against heavy opposition, the offensive finally halted the Chinese advance. By the end of February, UN forces reached the outskirts of Seoul, recovering lost ground. There were other struggles in the war. On April 11, 1951, President Harry S. Truman dismissed Douglas MacArthur for challenging his authority and publicly criticizing his policies, and replaced him with General Ridgway. Later the same month, UN forces regained control of Seoul. The Chinese renewed the attack, putting an army of more than 450,000 against the UN with heavy casualties. But UN forces under the new command of General James Van Fleet outmaneuvered the Chinese and pushed them north. By late June, a stalemate developed as battle lines stabilized near the 38th parallel, the original border that had been crossed a year earlier. The war dragged on for another 2 years as negotiations for peace broke down repeatedly. When the issue of the return of prisoners of war was finally resolved, offering a choice of repatriation or defection, an armistice was concluded that ended the war on July 27, 1953. Almost 1 million Chinese and over 500,000 North Koreans were killed or wounded in the war, with over 300,000 UN casualties. Both countries were devastated. To this day, North and South Korea still face each other over a demilitarized zone with an uneasy truce.
Vietnam. The United States' official declaration of war on North Vietnam in 1964 came after an alleged incident involving 2 U.S. destroyers being attacked by North Vietnamese PT boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. This was known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This single situation was the catalytic pretext for massive troop deployment and full-fledged warfare. One problem, however: the attack on the U.S. destroyers by Vietnamese PT boats never happened. It was a completely staged event to have an excuse to enter the war. Former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara stated years later that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a mistake, while many other insiders and officers have come forward, relaying that it was a contrived farce, a complete lie. Once in the war, it was business as usual. In October 1966, President Lyndon Johnson lifted trading restrictions on the Soviet bloc, knowing full well that the Soviets were providing upwards of 80% of North Vietnam's war supplies. Consequently, Rockefeller interests financed factories in the Soviet Union, which the Soviets used to manufacture military equipment and send it to North Vietnam. However, the funding of both sides of this conflict was only one side of the coin. In 1985, Vietnam's rules of engagement were declassified. This detailed what American troops were and were not allowed to do in the war. It included absurdities like North Vietnamese anti-aircraft missile systems could not be bombed until they were known to be fully operational. No enemy could be pursued once they crossed the border of Laos or Cambodia. And most revealing of all, the most critical strategic targets were not allowed to be attacked unless initiated by high military officials. Apart from these imposed ludicrous limitations, North Vietnam was informed of these restrictions and therefore could base entire strategies around the limitations of the American forces. This is why the war went on so long. And the bottom line is this: the Vietnam War was never meant to be won, just sustained. This war for profit resulted in 58,000 American deaths and 3 million dead Vietnamese.
In the early 1960s, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, L.O. Lemonster, concocted a plan for false flag operations as a pretext to invade Cuba and for war with the Soviet Union. In Operation Northwoods, they planned to hijack jets by remote control, crash them, and blame the attack on Cuba. There were many other terrorist attacks they planned to carry out that were contained within the document. One scenario mentioned was the destruction of a U.S. naval vessel that was to be blamed on a foreign power as a pretext for war with any enemy they picked. President Lyndon Baines Johnson went operational with Northwoods on June 8, 1967 during the Six-Day War. During the Six-Day War between Israel and the Arab nations, the USS Liberty was sent by Johnson to collect electronic intelligence in the eastern Mediterranean. The clearly marked U.S. intelligence ship was 14 miles off the coast of Israel in international waters.
A short time after the air attack had been completed, the 3 torpedo boats approached us from our starboard quarter at high speed and in an apparent torpedo launch attitude.
Israeli surveillance aircraft flew low over the ship and clearly identified it as an American vessel. At 2 p.m. that afternoon, the USS Liberty was attacked by 3 Mirage 3 fighter bombers. From the onset of the attack, the fighter bombers were jamming U.S. signals. Not only were they jamming U.S. signals specifically, they were also unmarked, the only unmarked aircraft in Israel's arsenal. Fighter bombers strafed the ships with their cannons, dropped conventional munitions and napalm on the ship, repeatedly from stem to stern. After the Mirages had done their work, the ship was hit by medium bomber Dassault missiles carrying napalm and other munitions like white phosphorus. The USS Liberty was then attacked by 3 Israeli torpedo boats bearing Israeli flags. The torpedo gunboats opened fire with high-caliber machine guns and launched torpedoes. A single torpedo struck the ship, blowing a hole in both sides, entering the ship and leaving a 30-foot exit hole when it exploded. Then the torpedo boats began strafing life rafts in the water, an international war crime. While all of this was happening, the oversized American flag flew clearly above the ship. The attack on the Liberty went on for hour after hour after hour. During the entire attack, the USS Liberty continually called the Sixth Fleet that was nearby, begging for air support or rescue. 2 aircraft carriers in the Med responded by launching fighter aircraft. Unbelievably, they were recalled by the White House. Rear Admiral Geist, then commanding the carriers in the Sixth Fleet, called Washington personally to confirm the recall order. Secretary of Defense McNamara came on the line, and then President Johnson himself told Geis, I want that goddamn ship going to the bottom. No help. Recall the wings. Imagine being Admiral Geis begging the president to allow you to defend an American ship that's under attack and being told by him that he wants the ship going to the bottom. Despite the fact that the U.S. carriers withdrew their help, a Russian spy ship appeared and witnessed part of the attack. After 3 hours into the attack, the Israelis withdrew because there were witnesses, allowing the damaged USS Liberty to limp to safety. 40 years after the attack on the USS Liberty, we know exactly what happened. I've interviewed former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Thomas Moore. I've interviewed the admirals that were on the line who heard what President Johnson said. I've even talked to the head JAG officer of the Navy who was ordered to falsify the reports and cover up what had really happened. One of the Israeli pilots has gone public as well, saying that 3 times he refused over his radio to headquarters to attack the ship, saying clearly that it was an American ship in international waters and an ally. He was ordered under threat of court-martial to engage the ship. In a nutshell, this is what happened. President Johnson had personal control over the ship, parked it in the Mediterranean, made a backroom deal with Israel to attack it with an order to kill all aboard. Then the attack on the ship was to be blamed on Egypt. The U.S. would enter the war and take over the entire Middle East in the aftermath of the attack on the most highly decorated ship in U.S. history. The captain and his entire crew were told they would spend life in prison or be killed if they told anyone what happened. Captain William L. McGonigal was given the Congressional Medal of Honor in secret and told not to tell anyone that he had won the award.
In 1990, the situation between the United States and Iraq had grown tense, and the group of neoconservatives around President Bush convinced him it was time to attack Saddam Hussein. The U.S. secretly informed Saddam that they had nothing against him taking over the oil fields of Kuwait, a territory the Iraqi dictator had always claimed as his own. Saddam took the bait, and Iraq invaded Kuwait.
Tonight, the first pictures of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
At that point, Dick Cheney, who was then Secretary of Defense, gave Saudi Arabia some satellite photos in which 250,000 Iraqi soldiers could be seen amassing behind the Kuwaiti border. Fearing an invasion, the Saudis granted the U.S. the extraordinary permission to establish military bases on the territory. At the same time, the worldwide media launched a heavy campaign against Saddam, who was accused of having used lethal gas against his own people. No mention was made to the fact that the gas had been sold to Saddam by the United States, which then stood silent during the massacre, even though they were perfectly aware of it. The media campaign against the Iraqi dictator reached its peak with this touching testimony from a young Kuwaiti nurse, who described to the world the atrocities committed by the Iraqi soldiers in her invaded country.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
The news shocked the entire world, and from that moment no one had a word to say about the American bombing of Iraq. Ten years later, some journalists stumbled onto a set of satellite photographs taken by the Russians over the same desert in the same days.
It's what it didn't show that was more important. What you would have expected to have seen were tanks on the border. There were none that could be seen. There was nothing behind the border that could have supported that kind of number of troops and tanks.
The same pictures that showed the Iraqi tanks in Kuwait City also showed that there was absolutely nothing behind the Saudi border. Not a tank, not a vehicle, not a single man. At the same time, the nurse who had brought to tears the entire world turned out to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador in Washington. She had faked the entire incubator story after having been professionally trained by one of the most important advertising agencies in Washington, Hill and Knowlton. In the meantime, the U.S. had wiped out the entire Iraqi army, and had managed to establish permanent military bases in Saudi Arabia. In a cruel and ruthless shooting spree, and against all international treaties, the U.S. Air Forces literally destroyed and turned to ashes thousands of Iraqi soldiers on their way back to Baghdad. Before taking this picture, the photographer wrote on the side of the tank, "If I don't photograph this, people like my mom will think that war is what they see on TV."
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing, and indeed it has. It seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. As you can see behind me, the Trade Center appears to be still burning. We see these huge clouds of smoke and ash, and we know that behind that there's an empty piece of what was a very familiar New York skyline, a symbol of the financial prosperity of this city, but completely disappeared now, and New York is still unable to take on board what has happened to them today.
Presumably there were very few people in the Salomon building when it collapsed. I mean, there were, I suppose, fears of possible further collapses around the area.
That's what you would hope, because they don't really know where to turn. That's the very sad thing. I think there's going to be a lot of very, very traumatized people that has hit them very, very hard.
Jane, I think many of us, when we heard the news, perhaps on the radio earlier today, were completely flabbergasted by it and just couldn't comprehend it. I mean, it almost sounded too far-fetched.
Looking like a Three Stooges movie covered in plastic, I swear to God. But he got a good thing, man. That's some good shit. Then we went back there. Whoa, 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 whoa!
I worked for Controlled Demolition Incorporated, CDI, the top-rated explosives demolition firm in the world, owned by the Loiseau family during the years surrounding 9/11. I worked for them as an explosives loader for 2.5 years. As an explosives loader, my job was to place explosives in the buildings to prepare them for demolition. I was licensed while in New York by the New York Fire Department to handle explosives. And I worked on major projects such as Seattle Kingdom, the Three River Stadium, Philadelphia Naval Hospital, and Keyspan gas holders in New York, among others. I currently live on the East Coast.
Isn't it true that anybody can implode a building straight down just by placing a bunch of explosives around?
There are many steps that you need to take. The first off is you have to weaken the building, and that's after a lot of studies have gone into how the building is built in the first place. To weaken the building, that means the staircase, all the staircases have to be cut at intervals. The firewalls have to be removed. The elevator shafts have to be cut and the rails cut, as well as the cars themselves removed. And then you have to move to the support columns on the particular load floors, and those are cut by a torch for two reasons. First, to weaken them, and also to allow for charges to be placed onto the structure, or onto the columns themselves. And that essentially reduces their strength by about 20%. And even with all of that work being done to weaken this building, it still remains safely standing, so we can continue to work in it. The story that just a few columns can cause a synchronized global collapse, an implosion, is, well, that's just nonsense. After the prepping work has been done, then it's time to load the building. And in the case of a steel frame building, that means we load them with RDX cutting charges, which are loaded with individual delays, sometimes as many as 2 to 3 different delays on a given floor. So you have to understand the work is complex and precise and requires years of experience. We were told by the NIST report that fire caused one column to fail, and from that point we had a global collapse of the building in a classic implosion. I don't see how this could actually happen in real life. When we load a building, we have to have all the support columns on a given load floor fail at the same time, within milliseconds of one another, and therefore the entire building comes down in a synchronized implosion. So I think this notion of a one column failure causing an entire building to implode in a synchronized fashion is just nonsense. I knew from day one that this was a controlled event, and why I did that is because simply looking at Building 7, you have a sudden collapse of the building. It's fairly symmetrical as it comes down. There's the classic kink, which means that the center core fails first, and you can see that on the video, and the building falls near free fall. So I really honestly didn't believe this from day one, because this is the way buildings classically come down, with a controlled demolition.
Now, in 2010, Syria was accused of a sarin gas attack against their own people. In turn, the United States, Obama, intensified U.S. military activities in and around Syria, increased all of our movements and military activities in Afghanistan, which, although he proclaimed he was going to be a peaceful president and said he was ending the war in Iraq, United States military activities increased in Afghanistan. And although we increased forces in and put pressure against Syria, Obama did stuff really weird and way off, and was not acting in the best interest of the United States. That much we do know. Now, during the Trump administration, has there been any false flag attacks that have occurred? Well, let's take a look.
We are just getting in some video of these U.S. strikes in Syria, along with this statement from the Pentagon spokesman, Captain Jeff Davis, regarding this strike. And we're going to go ahead and play this video for you as I read from this statement. There you see The attack, which was launched at the command of President Trump, who authorized this strike on Syria in retaliation for that chemical attack that we saw earlier in the week. This statement from Captain Jeff Davis talks about the strike being conducted using Tomahawk land attack missiles from the destroyers USS Porter and USS Ross in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. A total of 59 missiles targeted aircraft, hardened aircraft shelters, petroleum and logistical storage, ammunition supply, bunkers, air defense systems, and radars.
In this section that I'm showing you, there's something that you really need to pay attention to. You'll notice that those that are handling sarin gas, you see them in complete covering. Their whole body, everything is covered, and they have breathe masks on. Okay, you cannot come in no way near contact with this stuff, even after it's been dropped, because it still lingers. So what you're going to see over the next few minutes, the difference between those that are actually around sarin gas, you will see them in complete coverings, and then those which have been staged, because you will see them in zero coverings. And you understand, you go around somebody that has been just sprayed with sarin gas, and you're handling them with your bare hands with no breathers or anything, you're going to be severely affected too. So let's watch. Now, what you've been watching is the white helmets and those that came to help the people that were in the midst of the so-called sarin gas attack. As you have seen, these people are not wearing any breathers, they're not wearing any protective covering, nothing. They're handling these people, they're spraying them down with water because they have the sarin gas on them, yet not a single one of them are being affected. Think about it. Now, I have heard the arguments on both sides, and I'm sure those of you that are watching, some of you believe that Syria did do it and Trump acted correctly. Some of you believe that Syria didn't do it and it was a false flag. Personally, and this is just my opinion, so please don't blast me in the comments, from all the evidence that I've seen, whoever did the attack and whatever did the attack, the evidence is pointing that Syria didn't do it. And it seems like either the United States was involved and was part of it to instigate the cruise missile attack, which in turn, because of that, and the Russian response, the Syrian response, the world response, the United States has now built up forces and actually put a base just north of Jordan on Syrian land. We have a military base and we have all kinds of hardware and people there. We now have people that are in the northern part of Israel standing on the border. We have bases there. I mean, we've moved all the pieces in play. Now, when we look around what's going on and around the world and all the events that are occurring, and then we have to ask, is there anything else that's been said from the White House that may indicate that something is coming. Well, let's hear a listen.
And Trump hosted the country's top military commanders and their partners last night at the White House for dinner. The gathering came amid concerns about tensions with North Korea and the Iran nuclear deal. During a photo op in the White House dining room, President Trump made this puzzling comment.
You guys know what this represents? Well, maybe it's the calm before the storm.
What's the storming?
Could be the calm before the storm.
And now the president was asked again what he meant by calm before the storm, and he responded, "You'll find out."
Now, with that being said, let us take a look at what's going on in the world right now, with what's going on with Syria. Now Syria is saying they're going to protect the Kurds in the northern province, which is right up along Turkey, and Turkey is now shelling the Kurds. We have the U.S. military there. Although Russia says that they have been retreating their forces from Syria, they still have a large contingency there. The Iranians are there. What's going on in the Ukraine? Ukraine and Russia are on the verge of war, and if that happens, the United States and NATO is absolutely positively going to be drawn in. We got what's going on in the South China Sea, which has been continually going on with those contested man-made islands of China that the United States is saying they're not yours and they're in international waters. We have North Korea, what's been going on, and of course Trump and what is it, Kim Jong-un with their war and tweets, come on, man, you know. But all the military buildup that's been going on there with the missiles they've been firing off, with the nuclear tests they've been doing. And now we have South Korea is going to be hosting the Winter Olympics. Now, this video is being made prior to those Winter Olympics. And I have to think that that is a strong candidate for a good place for a false flag attack. Think about it. They do a false flag attack, they can blame it on the North Koreans and attempt to change the minds and the intentions of the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians as far as North Korea goes. I don't know. But it's also a good place for a false flag attack to occur to start the war. I don't know. We shall see. But beyond all that, I'm going to end this video with this. Your faith, your condition. I personally am a Christian, and I look at the Bible and I look what it says in Scripture and in prophecy, and everything that's written in that Bible has come to fruition to this point. All I can ask is pick up a Bible or on the internet, through Google, through the different websites, through Bible Gateway, Bible Hub. Take a look into what's going on with the prophecies and how they're opening up and fulfilling this day. Take a look at the condition. Are you a Christian? Have you accepted Christ? Have you repented from your sins? Have you changed your ways? It's something to seriously consider, folks. I personally am asking you to, if you're not a Christian, keep an open mind and at least take a look. And if you start seeing this and start to question, go to the first 4 books of the New Testament and read about Christ and about his personality and what he said. Hey, very well may change your life. Done my spiel. And I wish everybody that you're having a great day, a great week. I hope that you all be blessed this day and this week. And until part 2, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and then click on the bell and click on that little box that says notify me of future videos. That way you will be informed for all future videos that I do. In the description box will be the address to my Patreon account and my PayPal account if you wish to donate to help me continue on this. For those that have donated, Thank you so very much. Your donations are deeply appreciated, and they have definitely helped to continue to keep this work up. Thank you very much, and everyone, have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Peace.